Hello everyone, this is Holly here to do my final project proposal in my screencast over my Poplet. I noticed after I've been watching a lot of other people's so far before I posted mine that the times range anywhere from 5 minutes to 17, so I'm going to try and keep mine on the shorter end of that. So I'm just going to kind of jump right in here on and go right to left. So I have two main sections here discussing the results of my actual interviews with my ELL informant, but then also my ELL informant's background because I feel like that information is so very important to include in any um, second language acquisition research. So over here, I just stated that my informants seem to be, according to the long learner language stages, that he is in the emergent stage. Basically, that his messages are able to be interpreted, but that if errors are pointed out to him, he's not able to correct them still. So that keeps him from going up to the next stage, but he is still able to get his message across without it being incoherent. This I included this because in this learner language stage, it included the words backsliding and U-shaped behavior, and he definitely demonstrated a lot of that. So, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I thought it very important to include his learner language stage. I pointed out that he has the sociocultural factor of being immersed in English right now. So he's currently at Indiana University, South Bend, learning music actually. And so he's immersed in English at this point. He's lived in China all of his life, and in fact, at this point, he's only been in the United States for a few months. So, um, fully immersed in his L2 and studying at a university. And I feel like that's sociocultural, not only because he wants to be, um, I don't know, accepted in the culture, but also accepted in the culture of being a college student. So I think there's two things going on there. I included that his affect factors, because I think we all agreed that affect factors are extremely important when learning anything, not just SL or second language. So um, he seems to have willingness to communicate with me. He's pretty high risk taking because he just seems to kind of talk and he doesn't hesitate a whole lot. And I feel like even me speaking my L2, I do hesitate because I'm not super high risk taking. So I feel like I was able to judge that of him. And then I also put high motivation. I think that goes along with his sociocultural factor of being at a university here. He wants to be able to communicate. He wants to be able to do better at school. His current L2 learning is classroom based, um, but he's immersed in American schools, and the natural method has been added because whenever he's not at school, he is then using his L2 in natural settings such as, I don't know, stores and, groceries and getting around town, things like that. So he has kind of both going on, his context of learning. And then his early L2 learning, so when he first began learning English, was in the classroom. So he said a lot of that had to do with grammar learning. So that was the grammar translation method, was his dominant method. But it was also a requirement in China. So that kind of changed the motivation there, I think, a little bit. So either way, he was in a classroom for a lot of his learning. And I think that that has a lot to do with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, because then there is a teacher and student relationship going on there, and the teacher keeping them as much as as much as teachers can keep them in their ZPD, their zone of proximal development. And I also feel like that has to do with Long's interaction hypothesis, the fact that when teachers are teaching students, especially teaching language to students, they tend to change the way they give their input to students based upon the fact that they are, you know, maybe not as skilled as the teacher might be. For example, slowing down their speech and things like that. I put critical period with a question mark here because I think it's important to mention that my informant started learning when he was a child, but he's still an ENL student at the university level. So after all these years, he's still not technically very proficient. In fact, in my very first um, language background about my informant, I put him at novice high on the actual standards. So I find it interesting. I'm going to mention something about the critical period, but I'm not sure what I'm going to say about that yet. I don't think that it necessarily proves at this point that him starting to learn English as a child was necessarily um, the best thing here. So anyway, that's all the background about my ELO informant, and then that kind of just segues into my results during my interviews with him. So I'm pretty sure all of my examples came from the oral speech, um, the oral speech things that I collected. So from the prompts and from the picture prompts and things like that. So I just kind of have color coded the 5 errors and patterns that I noticed in the examples. And then underneath, I just kind of like tied in everything I thought went along with those. So for example, the incorrect use of the suffix ing. I'm not going to read all my examples of all of these, but just for example, I'm always teach student playing the piano. Um, I put this as tier 1 in Ortega's sequence of morpheme development. I found that that was very important to mention here because all of his errors seem to fall within the morpheme development, which I find interesting as well because I know that morphology is one of the last things to come to um, second language learners. So, but because the ing is a tier 1, which is actually the easiest morpheme to acquire, they tend to overuse it, and I thought that that was important to mention. The fact that Cantonese, which is his dialect of Chinese, does not include the ing suffix, and it kind of changes, like their verbs do a whole bunch of other things over there. That this is a coalesced um, example on the hierarchy of difficulty according to Larson Freeman, and according to Ortega's inner language processes, this is overgeneralization. Because the ing suffix is something that second language learners learn early on, they tend to overgeneralize and use it where it doesn't belong. So I thought that that was important to mention there. My next 2 are kind of very interlinked. So the first example, or the second example, sorry, is incorrect past tense forms, such as saying things like, but Jack never stop and keep going, when he was talking past tense should have been stopped and kept, and that didn't happen. But yet he has used past tense verbs like the word found down here in the second example. So I put on here, and I'm actually just going to link it to the next one as well. So the lack of the third person singular s. So for example, it's pretty nice. So he want to sleep as opposed to wants to sleep because he's saying he. So in English, we use the third person singular s and we have past tense forms. However, in Cantonese, they do not have any morphemes on their verbs. There's no tense markers or anything like that. They only mark for aspect, which is completely different. So the fact that these things do not exist in Cantonese makes them new on the hierarchy of difficulty, so they're both new. And because the third person singular s and the past tense forms fall under tiers 3 and 4 in Ortega's sequence of morpheme development, those are actually the 2 most difficult tiers. Therefore, it's understandable why an ELL informant would struggle with those. So I added some theories down here to these 2 errors. I discussed here Ekman's markedness differential hypothesis, the fact that the third person singular verbs having an S on them makes them marked. And that means that basically it's a little more rare to find and a little more difficult to grasp or to acquire. So that makes it marked as opposed to unmarked, something that is easily acquirable because it happens often. The English is one of the only languages that does the third person singular, and the fact that only one of our pronouns takes this morpheme is pretty difficult as well. And then I also mentioned Krashen's natural order hypothesis, just because that goes along with morpheme development. Like the fact that they're going to learn certain things in a certain order goes along with Krashen's natural order hypothesis. Let's keep going. So my fourth pattern or error is the lack of indefinite articles. So, for example, this is beautiful city and more than 100 people. In Cantonese, they do have definite and indefinite articles, but there's no such thing as an a or an. They just have the word one. So the fact that it goes from one to a and an is a split on the hierarchy of difficulty, which is a little more difficult than, I don't know, say transfer. It's a tier 2 in Ortega's sequence of morpheme development, so it's in the middle, difficulty-wise, of morpheme, of acquiring that morpheme. And basically, I think what's going on here with this one, in addition to the last two that we were just talking about, is interlingual interference and L1 transfer. The fact that his L1 Cantonese is so different in this case from English that it's causing him to have more errors. So his L1 is interfering with his L2. And that would be on the error taxonomy. And then I also added down here the contrastive analysis hypothesis, the fact that your L1 interference is going to equal your amount of difficulty. So basically, if you can predict that your L1 is going to interfere at some place, you can predict you're going to have difficulty. The more the interference, the more the difficulty. And I felt that that easily applied here. Lastly, I have an example here of the incorrect use of the suffix er, and I added this one just because I thought it was very interesting. He goes on to say many famous cooker is come from our city too. I mean, there's a lot going on in that sentence that makes it incorrect or errors that we could point out, but I thought that the incorrect use of the word cooker was, I just found that interesting myself because I feel like that is overgeneralization. The fact that he has been taught at some point that makes a person who does an action. So a person who rides a bike is a biker and things like that. A person who drives is a driver. But he added it to the word cook because he assumes, okay, a person who cooks is a cooker. Now, I don't know if that is necessarily because he was taught that. It could have been an induced error, but it also seems like it could have also been a lexical error, like he just couldn't come up with the word chef. So, or just cook, I guess, the fact that it's an irregular. So I thought that was interesting that that came out. I put down here that this could be an example of languaging. The fact that he has so many uhs in here surrounding the word cooker seems like it was almost like he was thinking out loud or thinking inside of his head to himself, like, is this correct, before he said it. But I also put competition model because it seems like instead of using, if he knew the word chef but just couldn't think of it, it looks like he just placed something he did know, something that would still make sense and would still get the message across, but was still incorrect. So that would be competing with the actual word chef. So all that being said, that is going to be the majority of my ELL final project. I hope I included everything that's required, and I hope it was easy enough to understand. So feel free to give suggestions and comments in your peer reviews of my Poplet. Thank you very much.